Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. As you know, this is a show about astrology. I love to talk about astrology with friends of mine, and I think that it's one of the more interesting modalities that's out there in the world of this. We have a wide array of modalities at our disposal, but I think astrology really rings true, and my discussion today is going to be a fascinating one, which I think raises a lot of interesting questions about astrology and how much we can depend upon it. Before we do that, I want to remind you about my weekly newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there I do a couple of paragraphs of mundane astrology, sort of that encompass the whole globe and all of us individually. And then I break it out into the individual signs beyond that. And I encourage you to always read your sun sign and your rising sign. You know, this is sun sign astrology, so it's going to be limited in what you get, but the theme will be there if you combine those two elements together. So, without further ado, my guest today is Joseph Crane. He is the founding member and the brains behind the Astrology Institute. astrologyinstitute.com is his website. I spent many years working with him as my teacher. I'm very proud to say he's a great teacher. I did a lot of great work with him, learned an awful lot through him. And years ago, when we were in the midst of our discussions, we had this, I think it was Joseph actually who had the comment saying, we must be careful not to back into astrology. And that just stuck with me in my head, and it's sort of, I've never let it go. It's always been in the back of my mind. The other day I was out walking and I started thinking about it again. So I thought this is a great time to talk about it because we're entering into a period where this particular year is going to be, you know, fraught with ups and downs and backs and forwards. And so I thought this was a good time to sort of peel apart this subject. So it's very honored to have Joseph Crane on today. Welcome to the show, Joseph, and thanks for coming on today.
Hello, Chris.
Yeah. So this is an interesting concept. We were talking about this one time in your office, and you said we must be careful not to back into astrology. And I found that to be an incredibly rich statement because of the fact that it's so easy to do that. We see these events that happen, we run to the charts, and we try to piece together a puzzle that provides explanation for what has happened. And I think that there's probably some validity in that, but also there's a danger in that. I'm curious what you think about that, how you sort of came to that conclusion.
Well, you know, it's interesting. And once again, Chris, and I'm sure this happens to you, people will quote you and you have no idea, you don't remember saying it, you don't know the context, and so you kind of pretend that it was from an emanation of your previous wisdom. You know exactly what you were talking about. So I think there are different ways of looking at it. Obviously, there's a level of not becoming too dependent, and that's part of it. Although there is a joke, and I'm sure we shared it. How do you know who the astrologer is at a car accident?
Right.
They're looking at their watch. Or when I remember going to Rob Hand's wedding, and everyone was looking at their watch because it was mostly a group of astrologers. It was hilarious.
And everybody wanted to know what time he was getting married, what the aspects were.
Yes. And of course, this can lead to, well, the fact is that most of the things in our lives, when we project to the future, we tend to use categories of hope and fear. I wish this would happen. I fantasize about this. This would be really nice if ... or dread. Mm-hmm. And so there's some combination of hope and fear in the future. And so people will often consult astrology solely from the viewpoint of hope, trying to justify their desires. Of course, a good astrologer will try to talk a client out of that. Or fear, and I get that a lot from people, which is they look at something, they look at an event, or worse, they look at their transits, and they're just filled with absolute dread. I had a friend of mine who's a client who was looking at her transits for 2022. And we wound up having a 90-minute discussion about her transits in 2022, which served the purpose of helping to relax her, but also felt really silly in some ways because we have no idea what the circumstances of our lives are and what decisions will be ahead of us.
So in that context, we could go either way depending upon the circumstances. If our lives evolve a certain way, something which may have looked ominous in 2018 might actually be beneficial in 2022.
That's right. That's right. And what we tend to do, because we have no choice, is we project onto the future our understanding of our lives in the present. And so we don't appreciate the fact that we have plan A, the universe decides what it wants to do, and we have plan B.
Right.
And 85% of the time we're operating on plan B, and then maybe the other 13%, plan B doesn't work out either, so we're on plan C because the universe just gave us a retort. So maybe 2% of the time we're on plan A, what we originally intended. And I mean, that's the nature of our lives, and it makes for life being very interesting. Astrology helps us clarify what plan A is, but also give us a sense of the resources behind us for the alternatives that come up. So, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you think, I mean, you made the comment of people sort of, I think I find this to be the case, that people tend to default to the fear mode most often. When they say, I bump into people on the street and they know I'm an astrologer and they say, oh my God, my aspect of this, and what are the stars telling me what's going to happen to me? Like as if the sky is going to fall, literally.
Right. And people often do not come to their astrologers to talk about how their lives are going really well and they hope it continues that way.
That's so true.
There's this wonderful book on psychotherapy by Irving Yalom called Love's Executioner. And it's made up of different vignettes, case studies that he had as a psychiatrist. And it's about the fact that clients come to him very hopeful, and his job is to kind of tamp down that hope a little bit. And so he feels like he's love's executioner. And astrologers sort of do the opposite. We're like doom's executioners a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And in spite of the fact that there are times in which people are doing well, and and the astrologer sort of has furrowed brows and a worried look on his or her face because the predictive stuff doesn't look easy.
Right. But in that predictive quality, there's always that sort of dualistic quality of anything that I think in true is astrology. Astrology is based on a sense of duality in some ways. For every positive, there's a negative, and for every sign, there's an opposing sign. So we're dealing with this language all the time. And I think hang on, I want to introduce one concept, though, that astrology helps us eliminate our knee-jerk categorization of life into positive and negative. Mm-hmm. There's a variation, there's a gradation, perhaps.
And it's not simply that something seems, something terrible is actually a great opportunity and is transformative and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. That has its own place sometimes. But it's also the case that something that seems really good has accompanying problems.
Yeah.
And you need to have, we need to have lives that have like a greater equanimity, a greater sense of balance, a greater sense of, okay, things are fine now. Later, they will change into something else. Mm-hmm. And our concept of fine is not very refined.
Yeah, it's so true. But when we find these events that happen in people's lives, it's the tendency to sort of dig do backwards research and looking at the chart for, say, a place and time. Say we took an event to happen
Sure.
to somebody, and we try to find out what was the trigger event for that. Was it, and there really is no. We have certain formulas with which we work in astrology, but there's no real consistent one that points to the same formula every time for every tragic or powerful or wonderful event.
And there's something to learn from all those times. Interesting that you mentioned that. As an example, we're doing a course on Kepler, and we're talking about the circumstances of our feeling of having fallen or missed the boat and then recovering the boat, as it were. And I went through a real dark year of the soul back in 1978. And so when I was first learning astrology, you get your computer program. Well, what do? You look at your transits for various important times in your life. And so I put everything I could around the year 1978. Transits were not that interesting. Solar return, evocative, sort of. Progressions were fascinating.
Oh, interesting.
And it was clear that this was a time in which in a sense, the outer circumstances almost didn't matter. They were simply the stimulus for the inner changes that were occurring, that were pretty dynamic.
And your progressions were more indicative of that than the other things that you mentioned.
Yes, I'll just give an example. My sun is at 0 degrees of Capricorn. I have Jupiter at 26 Cancer, and Uranus at 26 Cancer and Jupiter at 27 Cancer. By progression, what happened when my sun at 0 Capricorn went to like 25, 26 degrees of Capricorn? That was the bottom of my life. At the same time, it introduced me to an entirely new mode of living, even though that took time. And so astrology is a logi, it's a means of understanding. I think it's important for people to understand the past astrologically, even though you may have to sift through different techniques, and that can tell you something about the techniques, but that's secondary to, okay, well, what does this tell me about me, like we do with our birth chart?
And you found that the progressions were more accurate to where you were on a theme, on a broader theme basis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting.
Because had you spoken to me in September of 1978, I would tell you how I would have basically complained to you for as long as you would have wanted to listen to me, which wouldn't have been that long.
But that was more of and so the transits were not, and see, the transits are more, I mean, what would you give it as a range for transits? I mean, the moon is moving quickly all the time, the sun's moving quickly all the time. Sure. Those things can all change. I mean, you'd look for some of the more, I mean, obviously the personal planets would be more important, I think, too. But of course, then it goes to the outer planets are very important. I mean, you can't, those are all important things. I use those as markers or guideposts to say what the general theme will be going forward.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to look at events in a person's life and changing events, I find Jupiter-Saturn transits are particularly helpful. Obviously, the outer planets move more slowly. They're more indicative of long-term kinds of trends. They may not manifest in ways that we understand at the time. They introduce themes into our lives, and notwithstanding Rob Hand's wonderful planets in transit book, everything is not extreme when you have a transit.
Right, that's true.
Sometimes they are, but it depends on the circumstances of one's life.
Right. It's more like the idea when you see somebody post something on Facebook about an event that happened, say, something like the Florida shooting, God forbid, or something like that, and they try to sort of say, well, this, Mars was, square, or whatever, square Pluto at the time, and the transiting moon did this, and they sort of try to compile a a rationale or a formula or an explanation for why
Sure.
events happened at that time. My comment is that I worry about that backing into it because I think we try to find strands that we might ordinarily not have associated to try to justify our explanation of the event.
Yes, because we're imposing ideology on a mundane level, like we impose hope and fear on a personal level. It's really interesting if, and I've done this with students, and it's my idea of fun, is you take an event, you sort of don't say what the event is this a good or bad thing?
Well, yeah.
And you have people sort of speculate, not 20 questions, but okay, what are the energies involved here? And then we look at the event and we see in that direction how the energies are involved, not, okay, mass shooting, okay, let's look for Mars and Uranus. It may have been something else entirely happening.
Right. And I think that's sort of the thing that concerns me about the idea of backing in, because the formula is not going to be the same for all types of events. So we looked at all, let's say we looked at all, say, plane crashes over the last 20 years.
Sure,
we wouldn't see the same aspect in each time.
No, because the meanings, the context is different with all of them. The meaning is different with all of them.
Based on the circumstances of the time. Correct?
Compare the shooting in Florida with Orlando in 2016,
right,
where a gay nightclub was shot up by a man who professed loyalty to ISIS, who was clearly homophobic, who had mental illness problems on top of that. And I just watched everybody for the next week speculate and sort of use whatever ideology or preferences they have to understand the situation. As astrologers, we can do better.
Mm-hmm.
We have the symbols by which we can appreciate how different events may have different meaning, how they fit into a larger picture. That Orlando, or actually a better example, is in California. Come on. November of 2015, and Trump used that as a big display of, we're going to make sure that all Muslims coming into this country are properly vetted and garbage like that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay, totally different context from Orlando, different context from Lakeview.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that's what gives it that specificity and the uniqueness of the time and place, and so trying to get that, trying to get the formula to fit. I guess what frustrates me in some ways, what started this conversation is, why doesn't the formula work every time? In theory, in theory, it should. On a very basic logical.
However, Chris, you know, and I know the difference between the cosmos and weather.
Of course.
Okay, we are going to celebrate the beginning of spring in 5 weeks, simply because the sun aligns itself with the equator going north. Okay, there may be a blizzard that day. That's for us folks in New England. Mm-hmm. We may have temperatures in the 80s a week later. So, the cosmos has certain patterns, but we have patterns also, but you're not going to determine them in that kind of tight sequence. Things take a while to unfold, and there's always on this planet this factor of, you can call it uncertainty, spontaneity, you can call it chaos, you can call it the corruption of materiality. The universe is, the world is always surprising us.
It's true.
And that's a good thing.
No, it is. I think it serves a valuable function for us. I think it helps us keep us on our toes. I think it makes for challenge, and I think challenge is how we grow. That's what we see in the astrology charts. We know where the difficult aspects are. That's where we find our challenges. That's how we grow into them, and we become more complete human beings as a result. It's chaos is part of it, and I think there's so many variables that we really can't nail it to that. And because if we do look to the outer planets, they move so slowly, we're going to see more gradual. And so in that regard, the more gradual social things that we see unfolding in our lives today, like perhaps, sort of this unwinding of democracy, the Me Too movement, those things are all, I think, clearly indicative of where the outer planets are, and they sort of substantiate and support that. It's sort of they help us understand it. They help us understand it, and they help us understand that nothing is permanent. Right. Yeah, we are on a river that never goes back.
Things move on, sometimes in directions we like, sometimes in directions we don't like.
Exactly. And I think that when they do move in direction, there's sort of a pendulum quality to that, whereby we sort of go so far in one extreme and then we sort of bounce back the other direction. And there's sort of this back and forth motion throughout the course of history.
Sometimes, but winter can also last for centuries.
I know all too well. You must be a Game of Thrones fan.
Oh, no, I'm not, but okay. I've just read my share of early medieval history, that's all.
Oh, yeah, well, there you go. That's what directly was taken from. But this pendulum swing I'm referring to is a necessary sort of ratcheting of progress, I think. You sort of have this 2 steps forward, 1 step back, perhaps, or some variation of that theme that allows us to get somewhere. And it's through that hardship that we seem to make progress. It's more the idea of, these outer forces or these inner, this sense of where the planets are and how they impact us on a daily basis. You must have had people come to you saying, can we look at this day in my chart because I had a terrible day in that chart. You go look at that chart and you don't and you don't really see much, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so you have to find out what made the day so terrible.
And that's context is unique to each individual.
Right. And it's a unique, it may be a matter of interpretation. It may be simply that what appears to have been a terrible day internally is simply part of a larger movement. I was mentioning I had a sort of an quite emergency client who was going through some difficulties right now, and part of my role with her was to say, okay, what's the continuity? This is now, but how are things going to unfold during the course of this year? Let's look at it not as a skirmish, but a campaign.
Okay. That's a good way of looking at it. Yeah, I think the skirmish versus the campaign. So you approach this as a much longer process of learning and adapting and evolving as you go through that.
She just went through the bombardment of Mount Sumter, and I hope she doesn't have to go through Shiloh and Gettysburg on her way to Appomattox.
Exactly right. It may be a while, but that was a 5-year war, so I mean these things are slow, and we typically see this sort of reconstruction happening in our lives, and we can even see it in the chart of the United States if we see where Pluto is, and
absolutely,
this is clearly evident as we look out across the landscape. We see so much of this happening, and it is. But I think that these are also like gigantic prods that are forcing us to sort of come to some rational way forward that is something of a different, or but you have to admit there is this sort of pendulum aspect to this. There's this back and forthness of. We have these 8 years of what we consider to be sort of evolutionary and progressive, and then we go back, we go backwards, and it's that ratchet effect.
Well, I think that's also because on a mundane level, like a personal level, we are composite.
Yeah.
That, we know that, right, let's pretend that, Jupiter is in our first, and so, we can't fail to impress people with our style and who we are, and people like us and they look up to us. But Jupiter moves on, and we've ignored the fact that other situations in our lives aren't like that at all. And I think on a mundane level, sure, we can talk about the 8 years of being progress, but we have to also talk about, the Tea Party and guns and the increase in racial violence over Obama's presidency.
Yeah, that's true.
And so, that's all. So this country is composite. The world, I mean, it's interesting. If you scan across the world, you find authoritarian, some places becoming more authoritarian. Other places are arresting their leaders for corruption.
Yeah, I know.
So it reflects. I mean, obviously there are trends, but it's never one thing only.
Right. And in those two cases that you mentioned, there is reconstruction evident in both of them. So there is, whether it be positive or negative, the overarching theme of reconstruction is what joins them.
Yeah. And sometimes I think there's just a natural life cycle that occurs within cultures. I mean, Arnold Toynbee wrote about that in terms of civilizations back, 50, 60 years ago. Is that, and with America, obviously I'm not here for my punditry, but in America we have to look at the so-called American century only being about 50 years.
Yeah, I can see that. Post-World War II, yeah.
And now what's happening is, I read articles about China and becoming much more environmentally oriented. Their new version of the Silk Road, which is basically going to raise living standards across Asia into Europe. It's like, okay, maybe there's a baton that's being passed, and we can look at that astrologically.
Yeah, and I do see that. They do seem to be heading in the right direction with regard to that. It certainly is. And that's, that's where I think the astrology gets especially poignant, because if we see these long-term trends, and we can trace these historical trends. And that, I think, works fine for large, mundane events or societies or cultures or countries. That all works fine. Yeah. It's when we get into the minutiae that things get a little bit...
Yeah, and sometimes there's a fudge factor involved that... we'll look at mundane historical astrologers, not astrologers historically, but astrologers who study history will look at outer planet trends, and they'll try to find all kinds of events in life or events in history that sort of conform to that particular trend, whereas there's a whole lot of other stuff going on too.
Yeah. And some of these are natural trends that happen, but they do seem to be clearly evident in what we see in the charts. We're speaking today with Joseph Crane. He's the brains behind astrologyinstitute.com.
And the brawn. And I'm also the brawn behind the astrology.
Oh, the brawn. Okay, well, I didn't want to leave just the brains in there, but we'll let you do the heavy lifting as well. Astrologyinstitute.com is his website. We're talking about backing into astrology today. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back. In the meantime, have a glance at his website, astrologyinstitute.com. Joseph is also an instructor at Kepler University, which is located out on the West Coast, but you can attend virtually from anywhere as long as you got a computer and a good Wi-Fi connection. So I encourage you.
And you can teach virtually from anywhere, including Rhode Island.
There you go. So what could be better? It's a marriage of great technology and wonderful knowledge altogether. So it's a wonderful thing. But again, astrologyinstitute.com is his website, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes to finish our conversation about backing into astrology. So hang in there.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid
in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Hi, your host, Chris Flisher here. I've been producer and host of this podcast and radio show for the past 10 years. My goal has always been to provide enlightening, progressive, and logical discussions about where we are as a species and how we move ourselves further down the road towards our greater potential. I believe astrology provides a great tool for observing our progress and awakening our consciousness to becoming a whole, better, and more complete individuals. I have sought to invite the best contemporary guests, thought leaders, and progressive minds to discuss topics that concern us all, regardless of your beliefs. Consider making a contribution through PayPal to help keep the great wheel turning so that I can continue for the next 10 years along the same enlightened path. As always, I thank you for your support.
Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Joseph Crane. He's a wonderful astrologer and one of my teachers. He is the brains and the brawn behind astrologyinstitute.com, which is his website. He's also a highly regarded instructor and a well-reviewed author on a number of interesting astrological topics. He has a deep knowledge of psychology and astrology, which is a rare combination, although very much in step with each other because they certainly do reflect each other as far as a knowledge base. And as I said, he's an instructor at Kepler University. We're talking today about backing into astrology. And what made me, we had this conversation years ago, and it just stuck in my craw somehow. And I remember being on Facebook and saying somebody was posting something about some event that happened, and they were trying to put together the puzzle that would justify the event. And my concern is that well, on one level, you sort of want a formula, I would think, that says, well, if this happens, this happens, this happens, A and B will always equal this, but does it? And that's what we're discussing here. And it's sort of a interesting ethical problem, I guess, in some ways for astrologers to wrestle with, but also has a certain basis in logic that makes me think that. And so we started the conversation off by, we think of them, maybe perhaps the outer planets are much more reflective, I think, of trends because they move slower and we're able to see generational changes. We're able to see sweeping changes within cultures and societies and countries. But when it comes to the people who come to me or to you, perhaps, Joseph, with these questions about why did my husband leave me last week, we can't dig up that necessarily all the time.
Well, we could give a sense of maybe your husband, maybe this is at the beginning of a long process that may end in reconciliation or possibly in divorce. This could also be one of those temper tantrums that fixes itself within a week. And astrology can help understand a little bit of that. Where we run amiss is when clients want to use astrology to justify their point of view, and astrologers are more than happy to help them along doing that. Tell me why so-and-so is such a so-and-so.
Right, exactly.
And so I am loath to look at especially estranged partners of my clients. Because
trying to piece together a story for them.
Right, it's never an easy conversation. They're always looking for, how could I have married such a terrible person? Well, I don't know what, tell me how terrible this person is based on this chart. That's silly. So,
right, and one of the beauties of astrology, I've always thought, is the fact that because there is so much richness in the language and the symbology, it allows us to, in many ways, find the rationale for tolerance. We find this is how they're born, this is how we accept them.
That's right. That's absolutely correct. That was one of the first things that I learned when I started to learn astrology 30 years ago. That, not everybody is like me. What a revelation. Thank goodness this species would have been obliterated millennia ago.
Yeah. I mean, but there is that quality of trying to discover that, and I find that you may be able to find someone in your life who has been a bit of a pain in the neck or whatever, and find out why these people have this characteristic. And I can see that in my own personal relationships, those who have been good and those who have been bad, not to be so black and white about it, but there's many variations of gray in between.
And Chris, I'm afraid we can apply it to ourselves.
Of course.
When we're a pain in the neck, how is it that we are a pain in the neck?
Right. Exactly.
What is our tendency toward rigidity or self-righteousness or making excuses? Astrology is it's a mirror if you use it right.
Right.
So that, sometimes, I don't know about you. Actually, you're a good-looking guy always. But for the rest of us, you get up, it's like, oh, God. And other times it's, hey, you're kind of cute. But we look differently. Yeah. And the mirror is showing the same person. It's just that we are interpreting it differently.
That's a very good point.
That mirror.
Yeah, I love that point because that is very valid. I think that is incredibly valid because I think the mirror question it serves as an adjunct to our personalities that we and we are mirroring individuals. All of our stimuli, I mean, when we're growing up and we're very, very young, we learn by watching our parents. We learn by watching others, how they do things, the mistakes they make, how to not make the mistakes, progress they make. So we're always in that reflective state of what's coming at us and what we're giving back out. And what do we give out? Yeah. Does what we give out warrant what we get back sometimes? I think it does in many cases, both good and bad. You can be a wonderfully charming, bright, erudite person and get wonderful things back, but you can also be just the opposite of that. So, I mean, these things do manifest themselves in those ways. And I think
and some people do their best and the results are not to their liking.
That's true. They do.
And other people, they're like born on third base.
Yeah, or with a silver spoon.
Right.
Yeah, but it does make you wonder, though, especially when we look at the idea of transiting astrology, which it has its limitations, obviously, especially with the inner planets. You're going to have good hours and bad hours in any day. You're going to have good mornings and bad mornings. And and those seem to ebb and flow as we always would. But when we come down to these times of, say we had an eclipse, we had this eclipse last week, this past couple of days ago, and people are running around, with their typical eclipse paranoia of the sky falling and stuff like that, and wondering how it's going to manifest in their lives. And I get people calling me saying, where's the eclipse taking place in my chart? And I always say, the eclipses are a moment in time. It doesn't mean that you're going to step off the curb and get hit by a bus at that moment. It means that, any number of things can happen. It could be a slow evolution, a slow turn towards something.
And an eclipse it can be a trigger, depending on what the background energies are.
Exactly. And that's individual. That's unique to the individual and their circumstances.
Of course.
And I am the father of twins. I think you remember this. And it's been a great opportunity for me to sort of observe two people who were born 6 minutes apart over the course of their lives. And how do these things manifest in their lives? Because to me, as a purist, trying to be a purist, or at least trying to strive to find that pure quality of astrology, I'm saying, well, if this child does this, you'd expect the other child to do this as well, but their circumstances and their view are different. And there's been times when they have done things the same or similar.
Sure.
Married similar people or have similar friendships. Other times they're not. And this is where I've had a fascinating time discovering this and observing them over the course of these years, because it's like
fun.
Own little laboratory.
Yeah.
And so it does make me think about the quality, and I'm sure you've gotten those questions too from other people who've been skeptics, saying, "Well, listen, there's a guy who was born in the next room to me. Where is he now? He's on Skid Row, and I'm a CEO. What happened here?" And
I think there's a place for us to make different decisions. We're influenced by the other twin, obviously. What I sometimes do with twins is I'll consider them, and I'm sure you have, Chris. Maybe they have one chart and they sort of polarize, acting out different features of that one chart.
Yes, I think that's accurate. Yeah. I mean, you hear
So,
stories about
yeah.
that from, the good twin versus bad twin. You sort of hear that. And speaking of mirrors, one of the things I think is interesting about twins in particular is that most children, a singleton child will mirror their parents and what the behavior that comes from their parents is. That's their model.
They're more comfortable with adults, yes.
Yeah, I think twins, they may do that to an extent, but they also mirror each other. And in that, they sort of saying, and of course there's this drive to establish identity and uniqueness and sort of, I am so-and-so. How am I different from that? And if this person is this, then in order to be different from them, I've got to be that. And that may be a good, bad situation, for lack of a better term.
Absolutely. And it's mirrored in literature. Look at the plethora of stuff in literature about twins.
Yeah, I know.
Mythology as well, from the two brothers of Gemini. We have many of, like, Shakespeare's plays do riffs on twins and mistaken identity and things like that.
Cain and Abel.
We have Dostoevsky love to do like polarities between people, sort of using a twinship kind of thing. There are plenty other possibilities, and so I think twins are extremely interesting because they bifurcate one nature.
Yes, and that is where I think this is kind of gets to the core of what I'm saying. Because they have similar characteristics, or they are born with, let's say they're born with similar characteristics in their chart. If you're born 6 minutes apart, your ascendant's going to be 2 degrees off, but that's no big deal. But you come to this point where you have this personality that may have a propensity towards industriousness, say, just for lack of a better word, just to pull something out of the sky. And that industriousness may turn to be sloth in the other person. Just sort of that, that sort of that wiggle that goes on there, that wobble.
And that other person may have qualities with the sloth may go a certain introverted or subjective or intuitive nature that doesn't have to move around so much.
Right, yeah. And of course there's the competitive quality of what it must be like as well, trying to get the attention of, and that must start from a very early age. How do you, just from a survival standpoint, how do you get the attention of a parent if you're a twin?
But But in another circumstance, and I'm sure that's happened to you, they'll band together.
Oh, of course, yeah. And it's 2 against 1. I understand that.
Let's make sure we get pizza tonight, okay? Okay. We'll work on Dad.
You can make twice as much noise. It's very easy to do that, yeah. And it's just about enough to push anybody over the top. And I usually gave in, to be honest, just out of sheer self-survival on my own part. But the idea is that with this, I've always thought of an individual's chart as holding the germ of potential. And the germ of potential is the core of the personality. And sort of if you have to boil it down to simplistic terms, there's sort of this defining term that you might use for a person if you had to pick one word. And those characteristics are born out of the personality, and how that potential is unleashed is determined by, as you say, the circumstances. So if one child decides to live in the East Coast and one child decides to live in California, their external influences are going to be, their stimuli is going to be different in each of them, even though they may be in similar types of fields or even in services.
Well, it'd be interesting to compare. Like, you obviously have had twins who've lived with each other, but there are examples of twins who were raised separately.
Right.
In foster families and things like that. And there's remarkable similarities between these two people. They'll marry, like, people of the same, like, hair color. Right. They'll listen to the same music. I mean, not just classical versus jazz. I mean, like, they like Mozart more than Beethoven.
Right. They very, very precise.
Dress the same.
Yeah.
And it's like they become, because they don't have to interact with each other, they will exhibit more of their chart. But at the same time, people may have a core of personality is a good word. We'll use personality.
Yeah. I mean,
core of their personality, but it will manifest differently in different environments because it has to. So you can be a tyrant in the sandbox, a domestic tyrant, or you can be a dictator.
Yeah. And that direction, I guess, could be determined by one single choice, one single decision to go road A or road B. And
That's right.
I mean, I know a set of twins. I've sort of always been fascinated with twins because I've got them, and also because I know someone who's got a pair, and
Yep.
they are probably in their late 30s. One is married with child and successful and has a fairly good, stable job. The other one is completely off the rails and rarely touches base with home. People don't even know where he is half the time. And this is sort of a real disparity between these two people. Even the twin who is successful or reasonably successful by society's standards never hears from his own twin brother who you'd think he would have that desire. But these are identical twins. These are guys born, maybe 2 minutes apart instead of whatever. And so there is this, again, that germ of potential I was talking about. Sort of going one direction or the other. And I'm not sure if it's always that necessarily 1 and 0 or black and white or left and right, but in this particular case, it's an interesting study to see where that potential unfolded or how it got turned into something different. And I guess the expectations are there.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. It's like both people may have unlived potential, but obviously in opposite directions.
Right. I think wasn't there the guy who's Whitey Bulger, his brother. Isn't his
That's
brother?
a good versus evil twin.
There you go. Right. There's one who's a gangster and very successful gangster, and one who's the president of University of Massachusetts, I think.
Right. And Senate president in Massachusetts.
Right.
Yeah.
So they went. That's a good example of people who, there's this germ of potential. So there's obviously a potential for success and a fame of sorts, whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
Manifested in different ways.
Well, as Donald Trump has taught us, fame and notoriety are kind of the same thing.
Well,
or can be the same thing.
Well, they're cut from the same sword. I've always thought that the difference between a policeman and a criminal is very similar. I think it's just brought out in different ways. It's a matter of sort of power. It's a matter of self-esteem, control, all those things. I think they're sort of cut from the same cloth. Just that. It's that potential, again, that germ of potential that's there.
How many television dramas use that particular riff? It's very interesting.
Yeah, that's probably an old ancient theme as well. One of those old Shakespearean mythological themes that goes back as far as can be. I mean, Cain and Abel.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and we see these stories repeated, and it's interesting because it's this again. If we were to look at these two people, if someone came to you with two charts and they were only 3 or 4 minutes apart, and you'd have to, how would you determine which was which? What would the formula be? You couldn't. Exactly.
You couldn't. What you'd have to do is what I do with all my new clients is I send them a questionnaire. It's like, I need to know, are they married? Do they have jobs? What are their major concerns in life? So I can begin to apply the astrological symbols to their lives in an appropriate manner, knowing some context. One thing that I've done over the last year is a series of essays on people I consider very successful at being who they became, what I call exemplary individuals. And obviously there are a lot of examples, and I'm totally subjective in the kind of people I choose. But it's very encouraging to see how one can fulfill their potential astrologically in ways that make a contribution to the world.
Yeah, interesting.
And of course, someone born at the same time may have a lower profile, may not make such a contribution, make different decisions. But it gives you a sense of how this person became who he or she became.
Yeah. It's interesting because I have this interesting story. You'll maybe relate to this. About 10 years ago, I went to the Cajun Festival in Escohegan, Rhode Island, which you probably know about very well.
All right.
And while I was there, it was a huge tent of people dancing to Cajun music at night. And I was there with a friend of mine, and I saw this woman in the middle of the tent. There was probably 400 people there. And I walked up to her and I said, "Do you want to dance?" And so we started dancing, had a great time. And then we go off and have a chat afterwards. And I told her what I did. And I said, I said, well, what's your birth date? And she gives me her birth date and everything else, and it's the exact same time as my older sister was born in Providence, Rhode Island, in 1946. Now, why did I choose that person? That may be a synchronistic event that was fascinating at the time, but this person ended up opening a lot of doors for me. I ended up going on a couple of television shows. They did a series of like interviews with me and stuff. Mm-hmm. So she became a fairly interesting person in life, but she was this same. She was probably, my mother and father were probably in the hospital when she was there at the same time. This is how close it was. And so this was a remarkably interesting kind of story for me, because it's like, wow, there was 100 people there. Why did I pick out this person? Is that
I like Alcoholics Anonymous has this wonderful definition of coincidence. It's God's way of remaining anonymous.
I like that. That's good. Yeah, it's perfect.
But for me, it has to do with sort of the miraculous nature of the world in which we live. Mm-hmm. That, and chaos people talk about strange attractors. The fact that in life, these seeming coincidences seem to happen in some kind of a pattern.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's very interesting to try to detect that pattern astrologically. And I think you can do that to a great extent. How you and this woman met. Now, that would be, I would love to sort of look at the charts, look at the transits, see if there's some kind of message there. But one thing that astrology opens us up to is the universe's miraculous quality. And if we try to, and back to our original theme, if we try to use astrology mechanically and figure that, things will unfold just as the planets dictate they will, we're not only abusing astrology, but we're losing the fun part of our lives, which is the fact that that you may know your transits, but you still have to wake up to your world, and you don't know what the day is going to turn out to be.
Mm. And it's more about what your chart is composed of and how it responds to that day.
Yeah.
Which is...
And it tells you, it can tell you, if you look, what the pitfalls are, what to compensate for. So if you know that Neptune is particularly active during a certain period of time, well, don't empty your bank account. Bad idea.
Good point. Very good point. It has that quality of the idea of timing. Let's ask you this question: do you live your life via astrology? I mean that on a daily basis.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Hard to sometimes. There are times in which, if I'm working with clients, the last thing I want to do is look at my own stuff. Sometimes, though, I'll give you an example. Last October, I was talking with a client, and I was talking about Saturn going through Sagittarius, and it was squaring some of her planets in Virgo or something like that. And I said, and on December 21st, it looks like Saturn's going into Capricorn. And I paused and I went, oh no.
That's where your sun is.
And my sun is 0 Capricorn. And then I finished with my client. I said, I got to look at my solar return. This is ridiculous. Lo and behold, ascendant was 2 degrees of Capricorn, along with the sun, along with Saturn. Okay, and of course I had to do a PDF and put it on Facebook because it was just so bizarre. And so I look at my life this year through the lens of, okay, I have Saturn rising conjunct my sun in Capricorn. I'm going to be Saturn this year.
Yep. You're going to be serious. You're going to be dutiful. You're going to be responsible.
I'm not doing very good at being frugal, but I hope to be frugal at some point this year. I'm going to be
the year is new.
I'm gonna try to be humble. Actually, that's easier than being frugal these days.
It is.
But things like, but I need to take better care of myself, make fewer presumptions on what my body can handle, and try to attend to what's important.
A tightening of the reins.
Tightening of the reins. The universe has me by a fairly short leash this year. Right. Okay, I'm glad I know it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the beauty of it. But that is a Saturn trend that would be very valuable for anybody to understand that. I think if people knew where their Saturn and Jupiter were, I think you're right. I think that Saturn and Jupiter are much better barometers of where we are going than many other planets in the chart.
Yeah, I will use that. I'll use those 2 planets in addition with Mars for the more short-term stuff.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
Because Mars excites us, and most people see me, they're pretty excited at the time. Not in a good way.
Right. Well, I've never seen, as you said earlier, people rarely seek out therapists or astrologers when things are rosy. They just go along with it. They say, well, life is good. I'm going to keep it this way. It's only when the poop hits the ventilator that they begin to...
Well, I like to quote that there are no skeptics in foxholes.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Now, when the bullets are whistling over your head, you want to talk to somebody like me.
Yeah, exactly. And it does make perfect sense for that to have that. And I think that you serve a valuable function in that regard because of the sort of you as an outside, all astrologers serve this function. We become outside objective observers of what's happening in a life in a way that we can allow people to say, yes, I can sort of see why this is happening in your life. I can see the challenges that are building up here, but I can also tell you that it's going to pass. It's going to, like all things, it's going to pass. The river will keep running.
That's why this woman had to contact me to talk with me before we met. It's like she was furious, and she said, I know you can offer perspective, and you can help me understand the whole entire situation. And she was just angry. So that's my job, and I'm glad people appreciate it when they do.
When you become sort of a sounding board, in your studies of psychology, you would have seen the very similar kind of trade set. I mean, your same sort of offering counsel, offering objectivity to a way, but I think astrology provides sort of a greater logic and a sort of, especially when, whenever I see somebody new, a client, I actually take a different approach than you. I like to know as little as possible about them, simply because I like to see if I can discover that through the use of the chart. And I typically do, and that is sort of it adds to the, I think that adds to the validity.
There is this what I call the Zen of chart preparation, which is you do your preparation as much time as you need, then you forget your preparation. Mm-hmm. Then you talk to your client. And you let things emerge on their own way instead of making assumptions.
Yeah, I think that's valuable. I think that makes sense. It certainly gives you a more holistic approach to who they are and stuff. Yeah. Wow, interesting topic. This is this is sort of a astrologer's philosophy discussion that could go on for quite some time, but we unfortunately
we tend to do that.
We've run out of time, unfortunately. But I encourage anybody who is interested in these topics or in astrology in general to look up Joseph. It's astrologyinstitute.com is his website. He is a very knowledgeable man. He's got a great background in psychology, which I think dovetails very nicely with astrology, as everybody has always mentioned and will continue to see the case. He also is an instructor at Kepler University, where you can be a virtual student anywhere. You can have your feet in the water in the Caribbean and study astrology with Joseph via the Kepler University.
And I will continue to work on my humility in spite of your introductions.
Okay, well, all right.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. That's your task. It's only when you're faced with a challenge that you have to rise to the occasion.
Absolutely.
So I've given you reason to be more humble now.
The universe seems to provide me many reasons.
Oh, you've got enough of those already. Okay, well, good. Anyway, once again, Joseph Crane, astrologyinstitute.com is his website. He offers classes. He's the author of many books, a highly regarded intellectual astrologer of the highest order, and I'm a great fan of his, and it's great to have you on today, Joseph. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Chris.
And
All right.
I hope we got something from this conversation, and
Very
be
good.
well. Take care.
Very good.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.